What started as a peaceful morning in a quiet small-town diner quickly spiraled into chaos. One reckless biker thought he could humiliate an elderly man, but nobody in that room could have imagined what would happen next. The morning sun poured softly through the diner's windows, casting long golden streaks across the polished tables and checkered floor. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of sizzling bacon, creating the comforting ambience of a small town. Morning. In the corner booth, an elderly man sat alone. A cup of coffee cradled in his hands, the steam curling gently toward his face. His eyes scanned the newspaper with careful attention, the calm lines of his face giving away decades of life lived with discipline, courage, and experience. Round him, the diner hummed quietly, the occasional clink of cutlery against plates. Soft murmurs of conversation and the gentle hiss of the coffee machine filled the room. For him, this was just another peaceful morning, a moment to enjoy breakfast and the simplicity of life. The tranquility, however, shattered the instant the diner's door swung open with a loud bang. A gust of cold morning air followed, carrying with it the roar of motorcycle engines still idling outside. A group of bikers spilled into the diner, leather jackets creaking as they moved. Boots thudding against the floor with an almost predatory rhythm, their presence was immediate, imposing, and unignorable. The chatter of the patrons died down instantly, replaced by the low hum of tension and the faint squeak of chairs as diners shifted nervously. Eyes followed the bikers as they strode past tables, their movements deliberate, exuding an air of danger and recklessness that filled every corner of the room. The veteran remained seated, hands steady around his coffee cup, eyes flicking up from the newspaper just long enough to observe the intruders. There was no flinch, no panic, only a quiet, measured awareness that seemed to take in every detail, the way they carried themselves. The subtle glint of rings on fingers, the faint whiff of leather and gasoline. Most people would have been intimidated by the sudden invasion, but there was a calm certainty about him, a sense that he had seen challenges far greater than this in his lifetime. Still, even he could not ignore the shifting energy in the room, the unspoken warning that something disruptive was about to unfold. One of the bikers, taller than the rest, with a sneer that barely masked arrogance, stopped directly in front of the veteran's booth. He leaned on the table with one hand, tilting his head slightly, as if sizing him up. The diner seemed to hold its breath collectively. Even the coffee machine hissed a little louder in the silence. Then, without warning, the biker raised his hand and slapped the veteran across the face. The sound echoed sharply, a hollow smack that seemed too loud for the small space. Time felt suspended for a heartbeat. Forks hovered midair, coffee cups shook in trembling hands. The murmur of patrons stilled into stunned silence. The veteran's head tilted slightly from the impact, at his cheeks stinging, yet his eyes remained calm, unwavering. There was no outburst, no immediate retaliation, only a controlled exhale and a subtle narrowing of his gaze. Patrons around the diner exchanged glances, unsure of whether to intervene, their shock freezing them into inaction. A waitress, Trey, clutched nervously in her hands, took a cautious step forward, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The biker chuckled, mistaking the hesitation for fear, and leaned closer, the smirk on his face widening into a grin of pure arrogance. He mocked the veteran, sneering and taunting, his voice cutting through the thick, tense air. "What's the matter, old man? You're gonna cry?" The veteran's lips pressed into a thin line, a slight twitch of his jaw revealing the faintest trace of irritation. But his body remained steady, his hands returning to the coffee cup as if nothing had happened, giving no outward sign of weakness. He didn't respond to the mockery, didn't rise to the bait, yet there was something in his eyes, a flicker of restrained power, a warning that he was not as defenseless as he appeared. Patrons noticed it too, a subtle change in energy that shifted the room imperceptibly. The silence was thick with tension, a quiet realization that the elderly man was more than just a harmless diner-goer. The biker, sensing he had an audience, decided to show off, leaning back and laughing as he called attention to his so-called dominance. He swaggered around the booth, pointing at the veteran with exaggerated gestures, basking in the uncomfortable attention of the other diners. A few tried to intervene verbally, their voices hesitant, weak against the biker's bluster. The veteran didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, yet the calm intensity in his eyes seemed to ripple through the room. A silent challenge that made even the bravest patron hesitate. Each passing second drew the tension tighter, like a coiled spring ready to snap, and yet the veteran remained the eye of the storm. An unshakable presence in a world suddenly unsteady. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the biker, satisfied with his display, decided he had made his point. He spat on the floor near the booth and turned to leave, tossing a final taunt over his shoulder. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood today, old man. Don't get too comfortable." His boots clomped against the floor as he strode toward the exit, the leather of his jacket creaking with each step. Outside, the engines roared to life again, drowning out the whispers and murmurs inside the diner. The veteran remained seated, his back straight, hands wrapped calmly around the coffee cup. Patrons slowly exhaled, releasing the tension that had gripped them, though the atmosphere remained thick with unease. Some approached the veteran with tentative expressions, murmuring words of concern. But he merely nodded, accepting their attention with quiet dignity. He wasn't angry, not in the explosive, dramatic way one might expect. Instead, there was a calm acknowledgement that sometimes appearances could be deceiving, and strength was often measured not by aggression, but by control. As the door swung shut behind the biker, a faint smile touched the corner of the veteran's lips, not triumphant, not vengeful, but knowing. Those who had witnessed the scene might have assumed he was just an elderly man, vulnerable and fragile, but the glint in his eyes suggested a story far deeper, a past filled with discipline, courage, and lessons learned in the harshest of circumstances. The diner slowly resumed its rhythm, conversations hesitantly restarting, chairs scraping softly against the floor, the smell of coffee once again dominating the air.
Yet.
A subtle awareness lingered something had shifted. The veteran had endured humiliation without losing composure, and there was a silent message left for anyone paying attention. Some storms are weathered quietly, but the calm at the center can be more powerful than the fury outside. The scene ended with a lingering close-up. The veteran's hands, steady on the coffee cup, eyes thoughtful yet unyielding, as if silently preparing for what might come next. Outside, the biker rode away, oblivious to the storm he had truly awakened, believing he had won. Inside, the diner had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but a quiet tension remained, an invisible thread connecting the veteran to something far larger than a mere slap, hinting at events yet to unfold, and leaving everyone present with a single, unspoken question. What happens when respect and courage collide with reckless aggression? The veteran sat in his corner booth, the final sip of coffee warming his chest. The clink of the empty cup against the saucer echoing softly in the now quieter diner. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the parking lot and illuminating the rows of motorcycles parked haphazardly along the curb. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn phone, its screen lighting up his lined face as he dialed a number with steady fingers. There was no urgency in his movements, no panic in his voice when the call connected. He spoke quietly, words clipped but precise, his tone carrying the weight of experience. Every syllable hinted at a situation that required attention, yet it was calm, measured, deliberate. Around him, the diner returned to its rhythm, conversations resumed. Dishes clattered, and the faint hiss of the coffee machine punctuated the air, but a subtle tension lingered, as if the room itself held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Meanwhile, outside the diner, the biker leaned casually against his chrome-plated motorcycle, smirking as he recounted the morning's events to a group of fellow riders gathered nearby. His friends laughed and nodded, their voices loud and boisterous, reveling in the small act of intimidation he had inflicted. "You should have seen the old guy," he boasted, his tone brimming with misplaced pride. "Didn't even flinch. Thought he'd do something, but nah. Easy target." The group erupted into laughter, the sound bouncing off the buildings and filling the narrow streets with an air of reckless arrogance. He shifted slightly, tugging at his leather jacket and running a hand through his unkempt hair, completely. Unaware that his moment of triumph was about to be overshadowed by consequences far beyond his imagination. Back in the diner, the veteran's eyes softened as he ended the call, a faint trace of pride hidden beneath his calm exterior. He set the phone down carefully, folded the newspaper, and allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. The lines of his face relaxed, but the look in his eyes remained sharp, vigilant. He thought briefly of his son, an army officer stationed miles away, disciplined and capable. Forged by years of rigorous training and unyielding standards, a flashback flickered through his mind, memories of teaching patience and courage to his family. Lessons reinforced not through words alone but through action. He remembered countless mornings like this, not at a diner, but at home or in the backyard, demonstrating the meaning of respect, resilience, and strength. The son, even as a boy, had absorbed these lessons with a quiet intensity, understanding that true courage was measured not in bravado, but in the steadiness of one's character. The son's phone buzzed sharply, cutting through the hum of the barracks. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing as he recognized the caller ID. With a practiced sense of urgency, he answered, voice calm but commanding. As the details unfolded, his father had been targeted, humiliated, and potentially endangered. He reacted with swift decisiveness. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He knew precisely what needed to be done. In his mind, the image of the veteran sitting alone, the calm demeanor masking strength beneath the surface. Intertwined with the memory of training exercises, strategic drills, and lessons in anticipation and response. Every principle he had, internalized in the army, suddenly became relevant, as if the morning's events were a live scenario for which he had been preparing his entire life. The son moved quickly, gathering gear with methodical efficiency. Boots were laced tightly, jacket zipped securely, tactical bag slung over his shoulder, each movement deliberate and precise. Weapons and equipment were checked and double-checked, ensuring readiness without hesitation. There was a quiet intensity to his actions, a focused energy that filled the small room of the barracks, mirrored only by the roar of his determination. Outside, the streets of the town began to stir with the usual morning activity, unaware that one of their residents was about to experience consequences far beyond their understanding. As the son prepared to leave, the narrative shifted briefly to the perspective of the townspeople. Conversations in cafes, on porches, and along sidewalks speculated about the morning's incident. Whispers spread rapidly, some in disbelief, some tinged with worry. "Did you see what happened at the diner?" one neighbor asked another, voice low, almost reverent. "That old man? He just sat there. No one moved." Others shrugged dismissively, attributing the event to a reckless biker, a fleeting moment of small-town chaos that would soon be forgotten. Yet beneath the surface, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that this was no ordinary incident, and that forces, visible and invisible, were now converging in ways no one yet realized. Back on the outskirts of town, the biker mounted his motorcycle, the chrome gleaming in the morning sun. He laughed with his companions, shaking his head at the absurdity of his own audacity, completely unaware that the calm, measured man he had humiliated was not alone in facing this recklessness. Every twist of the throttle, every roar of the engine carried him further into a situation for which he was unprepared. Moving blindly toward a confrontation that had already been set in motion, the son's vehicle moved faster along the highway, cutting through traffic with precise timing, every mile bringing him closer to the diner, to the moment where restraint and discipline would meet arrogance and chaos. Inside the diner, the veteran cleaned up his breakfast, his movements slow and purposeful, maintaining the illusion of serenity. Patrons had resumed their conversations, but the atmosphere remained charged with subtle awareness. Some stole glances toward the corner booth, sensing an energy that could not be fully explained, a presence that seemed to radiate strength and experience. Veterans' eyes occasionally flicked toward the windows, as if measuring time, anticipating the next moment when events would demand action. There was no fear, only preparation, a quiet understanding that what had begun as a simple act of aggression would soon unfold into something far greater. Outside, the biker, confident and oblivious, turned a corner, laughing loudly with his companions. They assumed victory, imagining the story they would tell, the boast they would carry through the town. But the narrative had shifted. The son, a disciplined officer, navigated the streets with strategic precision, every maneuver calculated, every decision made with anticipation of the confrontation to come. The contrast between the biker's reckless bravado and the son's controlled determination created an invisible tension, a growing storm that no one yet in the diner or on the street could see fully. As the sun closed in, the diner scene remained calm but expectant. The veteran finished tidying his area, the faint smile on his face betraying nothing of the storm building outside. Patrons sensed it, perhaps instinctively, the quiet prelude to a confrontation that would demand respect, courage, and quick thinking. The biker, meanwhile, continued on his route, completely unaware of the forces converging against him, his arrogance blinding him to the imminent reality. The final moments of the segment left the viewer on edge, the diner calm. The veteran seated, with the quiet power of experience, the son moving with unstoppable purpose toward the town. And the biker unaware that the situation had already shifted irreversibly. The stage was set for the inevitable confrontation, each element meticulously aligned, tension mounting with every passing second. And just as the biker prepared to return to town, still smiling with misguided confidence, the narrative held a breathless pause, hinting at the reckoning approaching from the horizon, a collision of discipline, courage, and raw consequence about to unfold. The sun had climbed higher now, casting long shadows across the diner's parking lot, where the scent of gasoline mingled with the faint aroma of frying bacon drifting from inside. Tires crunched over gravel as a vehicle approached, drawing the attention of both patrons and the lingering biker gang outside. The hum of motorcycles paused, engines idling, as the figure stepped out with deliberate confidence. Clad in a crisp, military uniform, the son moved with a precision born of years of training, his boots striking the pavement with a rhythm that commanded attention. The very air seemed to shift as he walked toward the diner, posture erect, eyes scanning the lot, with a keen awareness that left no detail unnoticed. Even from a distance, his presence radiated authority, a quiet yet undeniable signal that he was not to be trifled with. The biker, still leaning casually against his bike, straightened as his eyes caught sight of the approaching figure. A smirk crossed his face, but it faltered slightly, a subtle crack in the mask of bravado. He straightened his leather jacket, ran a hand through his hair, and tried to adopt a posture meant to convey dominance and fearlessness. He spat on the asphalt, chuckled, and gestured to his companions with a half-hearted attempt at swagger. "Looks like someone's coming to play hero," he muttered under his breath, though the tone lacked the confidence it had held moments earlier. The gang exchanged uneasy glances, a flicker of doubt passing among them as they registered the commanding presence approaching. The air was thick with tension, an invisible line drawn between recklessness and authority. Anticipation building with every step the son took across the lot. Patrons who had slipped outside to watch the commotion paused in their tracks, eyes widening as the scene unfolded. Conversations halted, footsteps stilled, and the usual sounds of the town seemed to fade into the background. Every movement, every glance became amplified in the charged silence. The son stopped a few yards from the biker, arms resting casually at his sides, shoulders squared and eyes locked onto the man who had caused the morning's chaos. There was no aggression in his stance, no outward threat, only a calm, unwavering authority that spoke louder than words ever could. The biker shifted his weight, the confidence he had relied on beginning to crumble under the weight of presence and discipline he had never encountered before. The son's gaze swept over the group, noting their reactions, assessing the dynamics in a fraction of a second. He didn't need weapons to command the situation. His uniform, his posture, and the precision of his movements communicated a power that was both natural and practiced. He spoke, voice firm, yet controlled, carrying the weight of expectation and experience. "Enough," he said, simple and deliberate. The single word carried an authority that cut through the tension like a knife. It demanded attention, respect, and immediate acknowledgement. The biker's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He tried to speak, to reassert control, but the words caught in his throat, failing against the sheer presence before him. The narrative seemed to slow as the tension reached its peak. The diner's patrons watched in silent awe, absorbing the lesson unfolding outside their window. This was not a scene of fists and violence, but one of controlled power, of a measured confrontation where confidence and discipline were weapons more potent than any aggression. The biker shifted again, attempting to regain a semblance of authority. But every movement betrayed nervousness, a dawning recognition that he was no longer in control. The son's eyes didn't waver, his posture didn't falter, and the calm in his voice only intensified the biker's unease. The realization hit him like a jolt. He had misjudged the situation entirely, without raising his voice. The son detailed the consequences of reckless behavior with precision, highlighting the seriousness of disrespecting both individuals and authority. Each sentence was measured, deliberate, designed to communicate clarity, responsibility, and the inevitability of repercussions. The biker and his companions shifted uneasily, the bravado that had carried them through the morning evaporating, under the weight of controlled confrontation. Patrons leaned against walls and parked cars, holding their breath as they witnessed a scenario where power was asserted not through violence, but through presence, preparation, and restraint. The tension cracked like glass, and in that moment, the bikers understood that the easy arrogance that had guided them thus far would no longer suffice. As the son continued to speak, the biker's shoulders slumped slightly, the outward attempts at intimidation dissolving into hesitation. The group began to exchange glances, unspoken communication passing between them as doubt and fear settled in. One by one, they stepped back, an instinctive recognition that their position had shifted irrevocably. The biker's voice, once loud and mocking, dropped to a hesitant murmur, then silence as the gravity of the moment settled upon him. The son's stance remained firm but non-threatening, his controlled power radiating a message that required no escalation. This was over before it began. Inside the diner, the patrons watched through the windows, awe etched on every face. Quiet veteran in the corner booth had somehow orchestrated this resolution without a single word, his presence indirectly commanding the arrival of a force greater than the biker could withstand. Conversations whispered behind closed mouths. Admiration for the son and the veteran's subtle influence, mixing with relief that violence had been averted. It was a lesson in restraint, authority, and the profound impact of presence and preparation. The diner itself seemed to hold its breath, absorbing the weight of the confrontation and the resolution that unfolded without a single punch thrown. Finally, the bikers began to retreat, their collective arrogance replaced by reluctant acknowledgement of the son's authority. The leader glanced back one last time, a flicker of understanding in his eyes, and then mounted his bike. Engines roared back to life, filling the parking lot with sound, but it lacked the earlier confidence. It was now tempered with caution and respect born from realization. The gang departed slowly, their laughter subdued, the lesson engraved not by force, but by the silent demonstration of measured power. The son turned back toward the diner, taking a deliberate breath and adjusting his uniform, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Patrons watched as he entered, not with triumph, but with quiet assurance. The air around him now filled with a sense of safety and admiration. He approached the veteran's booth, his steps measured, eyes meeting the older man's with a subtle exchange that carried decades of unspoken understanding. No words were necessary. A nod, brief yet profound, passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of pride, relief, and respect. The veteran's calm had been reinforced by the son's decisive presence, a reminder that courage, preparation, and discipline were often stronger than aggression and bluster. As the scene settled, the diner resumed its rhythm, conversations tentatively restarting, chairs scraping softly against the floor, coffee cups clinking once more. Yet the memory of the confrontation lingered in the air, an invisible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. The lesson was clear. Authority commanded respect, not through intimidation or anger, but through presence, preparation, and measured action. The biker's departure left the parking lot quieter, the sun glinting off metal surfaces, and the diner hummed with the subtle energy of a story that had unfolded without chaos. But with undeniable impact, the final frame lingered on the veteran's hands, folded calmly on the table, eyes meeting the sun's across the booth. The nod between them was more than acknowledgement. It was validation, pride, and quiet relief. Outside, the motorcycles disappeared down the road, carrying with them a story that would never be forgotten. Inside, the diner remained a small haven of normalcy. The echoes of the morning's tension softened, but never entirely gone. The confrontation had ended, but the lesson resonated, clear and unspoken. Courage and discipline, when exercised with quiet authority, are often more powerful than violence. And respect is earned through presence, preparation, and control. The diner had slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, the soft clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation filling the air once again. Outside, the morning sun reflected off the emptying parking lot. The sound of fading motorcycle engines, a distant echo of the chaos that had erupted just moments before. Inside, the veteran and his son remained seated in the corner booth, a quiet connection passing between them, unspoken yet palpable. The veteran's hands rested on the table, folded with the calm assurance of a man who had faced far greater storms, while the son's posture mirrored the same disciplined control that had diffused the confrontation outside. Neither needed words to communicate. The mutual respect, pride, and understanding flowed naturally between them, a testament to years of lessons taught, absorbed, practiced. Patrons slowly resumed their breakfasts, some casting discreet glances toward the booth, curiosity and admiration interwoven with relief. The tension that had gripped the room now softened into a subtle reverence, a silent acknowledgement that they had witnessed more than just a confrontation. They had observed a demonstration of discipline, authority, and courage. It's not expressed through fists or threats, but through presence, preparation, and quiet confidence. Conversations resumed hesitantly, with a subdued energy that carried the residue of the morning's events. The diner itself seemed to settle into a new normal, a place marked now not just by the aroma of coffee and bacon, but by the memory of an encounter that had left an indelible impression. Outside, the biker and his gang rode away, the chrome of their motorcycles glinting in the morning sunlight. The leader glanced back once, a flicker of realization in his eyes, a dawning awareness of how foolish arrogance and recklessness had led him to a lesson he would not soon forget. The ride back to their hangout was quiet, laughter replaced by a contemplative silence. Each member of the group processed the morning's events differently, but the outcome was the same: respect for authority, caution in their actions, and the understanding that strength was often measured in restraint rather than bravado. The hum of the motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving the town peaceful once more. Though the memory of the encounter would linger in the minds of all who had witnessed it, back inside, the veteran poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, the familiar warmth a small comfort in the aftermath of disruption. He lifted the cup, taking a slow sip, and allowed himself a faint smile, the corners of his eyes crinkling with quiet satisfaction. His gaze drifted toward the window, following the emptying street, yet always returning to his son, seated across from him with the same calm intensity that had diffused the morning's chaos. The son finally relaxed slightly, shoulders easing, a subtle smile playing at the edges of his lips as he observed the veteran. The moment was simple, unadorned, but heavy with meaning, a shared acknowledgement of courage, preparedness, and the quiet power of discipline. The narrative reflected on the morning's events, emphasizing the importance of respect for elders and the lessons embedded in their wisdom. The veteran, though physically unassuming, carried a lifetime of experience that had shaped not only his own resilience, but also the character of those around him. His calm demeanor, even in the face of aggression, had taught a lesson more enduring than any scolding or lecture could, that strength is measured not by how loudly it is displayed, but by the steadiness and integrity with which it is exercised. This quiet assertion of authority had ripple effects, visible not only to the biker and his companions, but to every witness, in the diner, leaving an impression that would shape the community's understanding of courage, honor, and responsibility. As the diner hummed with renewed energy, the son reflected on the lessons his father had imparted over the years, the foundation of discipline and moral integrity that had guided his own actions. He had internalized those teachings, applying them precisely in the confrontation outside, transforming potential chaos into controlled resolution. The morning had reinforced a simple truth. True strength lies not in reacting impulsively, but in assessing, preparing, and acting with measured power. Every word spoken, every movement executed, had been calculated, demonstrating the culmination of years of guidance, training, and practice. The patrons who had witnessed the event carried the lesson with them in their own subtle ways. Conversations in low tones reflected awe and admiration, a shared recognition that they had seen something extraordinary unfold. The diner had become more than just a place for breakfast. It had become a symbol of justice, courage, and the quiet assertion of respect. The scene served as a reminder that in the most ordinary of places, extraordinary acts of character could occur, leaving lasting impressions not through spectacle, but through integrity and composure. The veteran finally leaned back in his booth, a deep exhale releasing tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. He looked at his son with pride, recognizing in him the reflection of values that had been nurtured and instilled over decades. The silent exchange between them spoke volumes: pride, relief, admiration, and the unspoken assurance that the lessons passed from one generation to the next had taken root firmly and would endure. The diner, quiet now, but alive with subtle energy, witnessed the culmination of a life's work in character building. Courage taught and courage demonstrated. As the scene drew to a close, the son excused himself briefly to speak with a few of the patrons, offering reassurances and quiet words of respect. His actions reinforced the lesson that true authority and leadership are measured by calmness, integrity, and the ability to protect without unnecessary aggression. Patrons responded with gratitude, nodding and murmuring quietly, a sense of calm and safety returning to the space. The veteran observed all of this with a contented calm, sipping his coffee and allowing the lessons of the morning to settle fully within him, a rare moment of serenity after the storm. The biker, now distant and humbled, would carry the memory of the encounter as a warning for years to come. His arrogance had been tempered by experience, his recklessness checked by the disciplined, measured response of those who understood both strength and responsibility. The town itself seemed to exhale, a quiet sense of order restored. The diner, standing as a symbol that courage, preparation, and quiet authority could overcome disruption without the need for violence. The veteran finally allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, recognizing the quiet heroism displayed that morning. His son had acted with integrity, decisiveness, and restraint, embodying the values instilled through years of guidance. Together, they had demonstrated that strength is not always loud or confrontational. It is measured, deliberate, and often unseen until it is most needed. The diner, with its familiar tables, smells of coffee and eggs, and the gentle hum of patrons returning to their routines, had become a stage for a powerful lesson in respect, courage, and discipline, one that would linger far longer than the fleeting chaos of the morning as the camera or narrative would draw back. The veteran lifted his eyes to the son, a subtle nod passing between them, a silent acknowledgement of pride, relief, and mutual respect. The diner hummed quietly in the background, the ordinary sounds of breakfast returning fully. Yet the weight of the morning's events lingered in the air, invisible but undeniable. The narration concluded with a reflection on the power of action, measured with thought, the enduring influence of lessons taught and applied, and the strength that arises not from aggression, but from preparation, courage, and honor. Sometimes the strongest heroes aren't the loudest, but the ones who know how to act when it counts. The veteran sipped the last of his coffee, the corners of his eyes crinkling in quiet satisfaction, knowing that the values he had lived by and taught had not only protected him, but had shaped the next generation to act with honor, courage, and discipline when the world demanded it most.